A child's world is supposed to be one of safety and discovery, filled with scraped knees and innocent mistakes, not, violence and death. Children are symbols of innocence, untainted by the harsh realities of the adult world, but sometimes children defy these expectations, committing acts of unspeakable brutality that shatter the idea of childhood innocence. When children kill, society is forced to confront the unsettling truth that even the youngest among us are capable of the unimaginable. These tragic stories are not just sensationalistic National Enquirer fodder. They raise difficult questions about justice, responsibility, and society's role. Are these children victims of their environment, shaped by trauma? Or are they inherently dangerous? Or, dare I say it, are they even evil? How can such violent tendencies arise in those that we assume are so innocent? And when they commit violent crimes, how should society respond? Should the focus be on punishment or on rehabilitation? Well, this is a dark, complicated, and very murky area that many struggle to agree on. But one thing is very clear: when children kill, it dramatically skews our interpretation of the world. Throughout history, there have been cases that force us to confront the unimaginable. Children who commit violent acts, sometimes murder, and sometimes in the most horrendous ways you can imagine. These stories, though rare, often spark intense debate about how we treat children who commit heinous crimes. While the crimes are shocking, the age of the offenders makes them even more unsettling, leaving society struggling to understand and decide on a just response. One of the most infamous cases is Mary Bell, an 11-year-old girl from England who in 1968 was convicted of strangling two boys, one 3 years old and one 4 years old. Her case is often used as an example of the impact of childhood trauma on violent behavior. Mary's history of abuse and neglect raised significant questions about how a child so young could become capable of murder. Was Mary simply a product of her circumstances, or were deeper psychological issues at play? Mary Bell's case sparked widespread debate about the role of trauma and whether society could hold a child fully accountable for such a heinous act. After a conviction for manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, Bell was sentenced to detention for life. However, she only served 12 years before being released on probation in 1980 at the age of 23. During her time in custody, efforts were made to rehabilitate her, and she was said to have shown signs of improvement. But you can imagine the uproar when it was announced that she would be released. Bell was given a new identity to protect her from public scrutiny and potential harm. Her case attracted significant media attention, and the risk of public retribution was high due to the notoriety of her crimes. In 2003, she and her daughter were granted lifelong anonymity, meaning their identity will be legally protected for the rest of their lives. Then there's the case of Jesse Pomoy, a 14-year-old from Boston in the late 19th century who tortured and killed several children, earning the grim title of one of America's youngest serial offenders. He was also given an array of dark nicknames during his time: the Boston Boy Fiend, the Boy Torturer, the Demon, and the Red Devil. Jesse's violent tendencies appeared early in life, with disturbing patterns of cruelty to animals as well as other children. Some experts believe that early signs of psychopathy played a role in Pomeroy's actions, while others pointed to the violent societal conditions in which he was raised. The brutal nature of the crimes that saw him lure small children to isolated locations and torture them along with his young age shocked the nation. He was tried for 14 murders, and at just 14 years old was convicted of first-degree murder. Despite public outrage and calls for the death penalty, the jury recommended clemency. In December 1864, Pomoy was sentenced to life imprisonment in solitary confinement at the Charlestown State Prison, one of the harshest sentences of its kind at the time. Jesse Pomoy spent over 40 years in solitary confinement, a punishment that severely impacted his mental and physical health. Over the years, his confinement was periodically reviewed due to its extreme nature, but public sentiment, driven by the brutality of his crimes, largely kept him isolated. He died in 1932 at the age of 72, having spent more than 58 years in prison. He remains one of the longest-serving prisoners in Massachusetts history. Fast forward now to 1993, and the UK was once again shocked by the tragic case of James Bulger, a 2-year-old boy abducted and murdered by two 10-year-olds, Robert Thompson and John Venables. The case stunned the public, not only because of the horrific nature of the crime, but because of the ages of the perpetrators. How could children so young commit such an act? Were they aware of the gravity of their actions, or were they too victims in some way? It led many to ask questions about the capability of children to understand the consequences of their actions and how society should respond to such juvenile offenders. The two boys were jailed for life, but released on license with new identities in 2001 where they turned 18, a move that continues to cause uproar. In the United States, cases like that of Lionel Tate offer another take on the matter. In 1999, Lionel Tate, then 12 years old, killed a 6-year-old girl while allegedly mimicking wrestling moves that he had seen on television. Under Florida law, the jury was required to convict Lionel Tate of first-degree murder, even if they didn't believe he intended to harm or kill anyone. The only requirement was that he knowingly engaged in an act of child abuse that resulted in death. Florida's felony murder law states that any intentional act that could reasonably cause physical harm to a child qualifies as child abuse, regardless of intent. As a result, Tate was sentenced to life in prison without the need for the prosecution to prove he intended to harm or understood the potential consequences of his actions. Critics argue that convicting young children of first-degree murder without proving intent to cause harm, serious injury, or death is deeply problematic. His life sentence without parole was later overturned, but the case left deep moral and legal questions about the nature of justice for children. Now, cases like these, they highlight the complexity of child violence. While children like Mary Bell and Jesse Pomoy committed horrific acts, their behaviors are often intertwined with factors like abuse, neglect, and environmental influences. And this leaves us with the broader question: what makes a child capable of such violence? And more importantly, how should society respond when faced with the chilling reality of children who kill? When a child commits a violent act, the immediate question is why? The psychology behind such actions is complex, shaped by developmental factors, trauma, and sometimes psychological disorders. It forces us to ask whether a child's violent behavior is the result of a troubled environment, a psychological condition, or something more innate. The development of a child's brain plays a crucial role in understanding juvenile violent behavior. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and understanding consequences, is not fully developed in children and adolescents. This makes them more prone to impulsive behavior and less likely to consider the long-term consequences of their actions. Neuroscientific research supports the idea that children are less capable of controlling impulses and making them more vulnerable to external influences such as trauma or exposure to violence. A significant percentage of child offenders come from backgrounds of extreme abuse or neglect. Research shows that 80% of juvenile homicide offenders have experienced some form of abuse. This creates a cycle of violence where aggression becomes the primary outlet for unresolved trauma. In cases like Mary Bell's, childhood trauma played a major role in shaping her violent tendencies. Mary's case suggests that the abuse she suffered contributed to her actions, raising questions about whether the violence she committed was a product of her environment. But not every case is so clear-cut. Some children who kill display callous, unemotional traits, a precursor to psychopathy. While rare, this was evident in cases like Jesse Pomoy, who showed extreme cruelty toward others from a young age. His indifference to the suffering of others suggests deeper psychological issues, which modern psychologists now recognize as early signs of psychopathy. The role of media exposure and a chaotic home life cannot be ignored either. Children like Lionel Tate, who was exposed to violent media, sometimes replicate the violence they see without fully understanding its consequences. The tragic outcome showed how unsupervised exposure to violent content can play a role in shaping a child's behavior. In Tate's case, his fascination with wrestling and the unsupervised replication of these moves led to the death of a much younger child, raising questions about how much of a child's violent actions can be attributed to media influence versus innate tendencies. Additionally, mental health disorders often go undiagnosed in children. According to the American Psychological Association, 65% of juveniles convicted of homicide have diagnosable mental health conditions such as conduct disorder, depression, or PTSD. These underlying conditions often manifest in aggressive or violent behavior, making it harder for children to control impulses or understand the severity of their actions. When children commit violent crimes, society faces a moral and legal dilemma. Should they be treated like adult criminals, or does their age afford them some level of leniency? In many countries, including the US and the UK, children as young as 10 can be held criminally responsible for their actions. However, scientific studies on brain development suggest that young offenders are much less capable of understanding the consequences of their actions. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child recommends raising the minimum age of criminal responsibility to at least 14 years, leading to debates on whether punitive measures or rehabilitation should be the primary focus for juvenile offenders. One of the most notorious recent cases was Jordan Brown, an 11-year-old who was initially tried as an adult for the murder of his father's fiancée in Pennsylvania. After public outcry and legal battles, his case was transferred to juvenile court, which focused on rehabilitation over punishment. But that was just the start of this merry-go-round. It turns out that a lot of the evidence that initially sent an 11-year-old into adult prison was shaky, to say the least, and in 2018, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned his conviction by a ruling of 5-0. It was a similar situation for Lionel Tate. Initially sentenced to life in prison without parole, Tate's sentence was eventually reduced, acknowledging that children should be offered a chance at rehabilitation rather than just being locked up for life. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Miller and Alabama from 2012 that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles are unconstitutional. However, juveniles can still receive life sentences with the possibility of parole in many states, depending on the severity of their crime. The ruling highlighted the shift towards considering a child's developmental stage when sentencing. Despite this shift, public opinion often remains divided. Some argue that children who commit murder should face the same consequences as adults, especially in cases of premeditated violence. In countries like Norway, however, the legal system prioritizes rehabilitation, with juvenile offenders receiving a maximum sentence of 21 years regardless of their crime. When a child commits murder, the ripple effect is devastating. It's not just the victim's family who experiences unimaginable loss. The families of the offenders are often caught in a whirlwind of shock, grief, and public scrutiny. Society demands answers, and the families of child offenders are often left grappling with feelings of guilt, confusion, and profound shame. For the victim's family, the grief is compounded by the fact that the offender is a child. There's a visceral, primal need for justice when a loved one is lost, but when the perpetrator is so young, it complicates that process. Many families are left feeling as though the justice system has failed them. The idea that a child might receive a less severe punishment than an adult who committed the same crime can feel like a bit of a betrayal. The case of James Bulger is a prime example here. The public outrage, along with the pain felt by James's family, pushed for harsher punishments for his young killers. While the legal system opted for rehabilitation, many felt this was insufficient in light of the crime. On the other side of the equation are the families of the children who commit these violent acts. In many cases, the parents had no idea their child was capable of such violence. Some are left questioning whether they failed as parents, while others struggled to comprehend how their seemingly ordinary child could be responsible for such devastation. These families often become targets of public blame and outrage, even though they, too, are grappling with their own grief and confusion. Research shows that juvenile offenders' families are also more likely to experience social stigma, isolation, and emotional devastation. In some cases, the families of child offenders become socially ostracized as their communities grapple with the enormity of the crime. The emotional toll can be overwhelming, and many families are left to pick up the pieces in the wake of such a tragedy. In the US, there has been a growing trend of holding parents legally accountable when their children commit gun massacres. Prosecutors have begun charging parents with crimes such as involuntary manslaughter or negligent storage of firearms if it's found that they failed to secure their guns, enabling their children to access them and carry out violent acts. High-profile cases like the prosecution of the parents of the Oxford High School shooter in Michigan have highlighted this, and authorities argue that parents who irresponsibly store firearms bear a degree of responsibility for the tragic consequences when their children commit gun violence. Addressing juvenile homicide remains an incredibly difficult task. While many advocate for juvenile justice reform, the debate continues over whether to emphasize punishment or rehabilitation. Restorative justice is a solution in which victims' families, offenders, and communities come together to seek healing. This approach emphasizes accountability and understanding rather than retribution. It has been used successfully in some juvenile crime cases, offering a path to reconciliation for both the offender and the victim's family. Countries like Germany and Scotland have raised the minimum age of criminal responsibility, focusing instead on early intervention and mental health services for young offenders. This shift recognizes the developmental differences between children and adults and acknowledges that young offenders have the potential for rehabilitation and reform. Now, despite these debates, rehabilitation efforts have shown promise. Juvenile offenders who receive counseling, education, and mental health support have lower rates of reoffending, suggesting that society could benefit from focusing more on rehabilitation. In some cases, children who committed violent acts were able to reflect on their actions, understand the harm they caused, and make significant changes. However, not all cases lead to successful rehabilitation. Some child offenders, particularly those with deep-rooted psychological issues or histories of extreme violence, may continue to pose a threat to society. This reality complicates the conversation about whether every child who commits a violent crime can be rehabilitated. The reality of children committing violent crimes presents an ethical and emotional maze. The tragedy strikes deep, shaking our collective understanding of what childhood is supposed to be, a time of innocence, of growth, of learning. But these stories destroy that ideal, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes children are capable of acts of unspeakable violence. The debate between punishment and rehabilitation isn't going away anytime soon. Do we lock these children away, treating them as criminals no different from adults? Or do we focus on their potential for change, seeking ways to heal the damage and offer them a path to redemption? The legal system struggles with this balance, and so does society at large. As modern and forward-thinking as we like to think we are, there is still a pitchfork-wielding mob inside many of us that screams for the harshest justice in response to horrendous crimes.